Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Natalia Szanowska, and I'm the host of Where Technology Meets Science. It's a podcast by Appsilon where we discuss how modern tools and technologies can accelerate data science. We're going to do it live for the first time, which I'm very excited about. And for the first time, we're also going to have three speakers. I'm going to introduce them soon. We are going to talk about the very relevant topic today, the foundation on which all the data analysis, data exploration, submissions to regulatory bodies is based. SCEs, Statistical Computing Environments. We are going to talk about the best practices, the success stories from implementations. And before we start, I just want to remind you that we are going to have a short Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So please pop your questions to our speakers during the webinar, and then after that we can spend a couple of minutes answering those questions. I want to start with a bit of a background behind today's discussion. A while ago, we started doing a couple of interviews with our clients, prospects, community, to find out more about how we can define statistical computing environments, what are the elements of that. And as a result, we were actually astonished with all of the different insights from different perspectives. And we are going to publish a report based on all of those insights. It's going to come out, I think, next week. I'm very excited about this, and all of the participants and people listening and people registering to the webinar are going to receive it via email once it's published. Okay. And I think, and another thing is just it actually brought the result of this roundtable discussion that we are going to begin now. Okay, first guest, Megan Dunham, is Director of R&D Data Sciences Technology Enablement at Pharmaceuticals. With over a decade of experience in clinical data technology, innovation, and analytics, Megan is passionate about integrating people, processes, and technology to transform clinical trial execution. At Jazz, she leads technology initiatives to modernize R&D, data science, and programming, including a recent implementation of an internally built programming and computer environment that provides data scientists with multilingual tools and seamless connections to Jazz data assets. Welcome, Megan. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be.
Cool. Then we have Andy York, who has had a full-time career in pharma for over 38 years, including working for both CROs and pharma companies. A qualified statistician, Andy specialized in statistical programming and has at times also worked in IT, supporting related IT systems, including SCEs. Over this time, he has seen many different SCEs implemented across several companies, as well as problems that can arise and considerations for what makes a good SCE. Currently, Andy works for Novo Nordisk as part of the recently formed Digital and Process Transformation Department, where he is the Clinical Data Science Vice President. I'm very excited because I want to learn more about what's been happening since the last time you presented and talked about the implementation of the SCE within Novo Nordisk. And as a part of this role, Andy is actually responsible for ongoing SCE development and the rollout. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you.
And finally, Rafael Pereira, who heads platform engineering at Appsilon, helping life sciences and data-driven organizations scale cloud and data platforms. His background spans cloud, big data, and product engineering across multiple industries. Welcome, Rafa.
Thanks, Nat.
I'm going to stop mumbling and let's start a conversation. Megan, why do companies need SCEs?
Sure. I mean, if you think about what we do in drug development, so much of that hinges on decision making on data, right? And that an SCE is that compliant, secure place where we can do the analysis that enables our business leaders to make all of those decisions. Do we escalate doses in a trial? Do we move a drug through the pipeline? Do we submit? Once we do get to submission, our submission deliverables come out of there. We would not be putting drugs to market if we didn't have an SCE to enable that demonstration of safety and efficacy of our drugs.
And as I can understand, SCE has been a core element of clinical data development for many years. But still, as many companies as we have, as many preferred definitions we can have. So to make this conversation a little bit like more clear between us, I just want to understand how each of you define SCE, and I want to start with Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I looked up the actual FDA definition of an SCE, and that's maybe actually quite a good place to start. And I'll just read what I found here. So, an SCE is a centralized integrated platform designed to streamline and standardize statistical analysis processes, particularly for clinical trials and other research settings. These environments are crucial for ensuring data integrity, regulatory compliance, and efficient collaboration amongst researchers. I think that's pretty perfect when you kind of think about it. I mean, I'd kind of add, obviously there's a lot of diversity to pharma data, different therapeutic areas, different endpoints, and this data, there can be a lot of inconsistencies in the data. It's generally messy, to have to work with clinical data, and so having a solid SCE that you can kind of rely on to analyze that data in a consistent, trusted way that is auditable and traceable and reproducible is so important as we go forward. So the ART acronym is one that's well worth remembering.
And Megan, if you could use your own words to say what SCE is?
It's hard to add much to that definition. I think that, like Andy said, the FDA nailed it. I think the other way to possibly think about that question is, I think that's a nice description of what an SCE does. If you think from maybe the systems perspective of where do you draw the box, what do you call your SCE? It's, I think of it as the infrastructure, the tool sets, and the data that that can comprise this controlled environment of where you can do the analysis and reporting of your clinical trial results in a way that hits the accuracy, the reproducibility, the traceability requirements.
Okay. So one of the biggest things is it has to be validated for regulatory submission. This is one of the critical parts and critical characteristics of the or features of the SCE. What, in your opinion, are all the parts and or all the features that we need to include or would define a good SCE?
So yeah, I mean, it's got to have the capability to be validated. So if you have a trusted supplier, and let's face it, the industry is using SAS as well as R now to do their analyses. You've got to be able to trust that their software is performing as expected when we run analyses through that. With SAS, it's a little bit of a closed book in the sense that people can't actually audit SAS that carefully or that well at the moment. With R, it's kind of more of a crowdsource approach to validation of packages and processes within the R programming language. So it's kind of a little bit different depending on where you are. And of course, you've got to make sure that all the components of the SCE are also working well so that your version control works correctly, for example. So your access controls are robust. Yeah, so there's a lot of different aspects to validation that go well beyond analytics. So, Megan, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think there's two ways of thinking about this question, right? Which are, what are your bare minimum characteristics of an SCE? And you talk about the validation, and I think absolutely, right? It needs to be auditable. It needs to be validated. there's also, I think, this imperative that we have as we look to modernize our SCEs to think about not just what does it need to have from a regulatory perspective, but also what does an SCE have in order to actually act as an engine of an innovative clinical data science department. And you can function with a bare bones SCE. You can get to results that you can submit, that you can use to make decisions. But I know that probably every pharma company out there has goals in their clinical data science department around innovation, around automation, around using data as an asset. And so in order to actually achieve those goals, then you start talking about features of an SCE like scalability, the ability to rapidly add new technologies as the external kind of field around us evolves. How do we add agentic automation of how we do our work? How do you make sure that you're connected to your company's core data assets so that you don't have duplicate copies of data? I think these are some of the other features that you need to start thinking about in a more modern version of an SCE. I don't know, Andy, if you have other kind of thoughts of some of those more modern features as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think the advent of AI is going to change things significantly as we go on, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about that as we go on through the discussion today. But I think also the democratization of data is something that you hear a lot in companies as well. So that third-party use of data and making your data available for that that secondary data analysis is so critical these days, because there is so much intellectual property and value in that data. And you'll find that people within your pharma companies are just clamoring to get access to that data and delve into it for whatever insights they can bring. And of course, a lot of these folks are using AI to help do that as well within or certainly large language models to help work with that data these days. So.
And I also want to hear Rafa's perspective here, because we want to talk about the modern SCEs and not the bare bones, as you, Megan, mentioned. So if you have had experience working with different companies implementing those platforms, how would you gauge the readiness of those organizations to design modern tools that are future-proof and then they're scalable and they're able to handle all of this like complicated analysis and then work with AI?
So before we get onto that, I just want to add something, which is within the definition that both you and Andrew and Megan gave, I think one of the important key elements that you were getting at, Megan, as well, is that the platform needs to serve the users and the people that use it at the end of the day. So beyond the regulatory submissions and everything else, it needs to serve its purpose. And I guess that this flows into the aspect of how will the company be, or how can we gauge the readiness of a company? And I think that having this mindset shifted from hey, we have to have just regulatory compliance towards hey, how can we make our users have a better experience and improve efficiency, innovation, etc. through the tools that we can give them. I think that's one of the good key indicators. If we want to talk about specifics, cloud adoption is a very good measurement to understand how likely companies are able or are willing to go through a modernization process of, for example, SCEs. It shows that people are ready to embrace new technologies. That it's a de facto standard nowadays that if a company doesn't have a cloud strategy or a cloud environment, that it's not competitive in the sense that it needs to be. The other thing as well is going back to regulatory compliance. If a company is willing to adopt cloud modernization, and that's one of the important metrics, compliance needs to follow. So the being able to have adjustment within QA teams and within everybody within the business to adjust their processes as well to fit to new approaches, I think that's a very good secondary indicator of this.
And you mentioned users, and I think it's a nice segue to like another part of this discussion, which is I think is very important to talk about users, because you're designing those for the people, for the data scientists and statisticians to use those environments. So one big part of it and one big challenge is the change management. But before we go into this, I just want to understand better who are the primary and secondary users that we need to think of when designing those tools. Megan.
Sure. So what probably first jumps to mind for many of us for primary users are our statistical programmers, our biostatisticians who are doing analysis probably on a day-to-day basis. As the need to work with clinical data expands, what we're seeing at Jazz at least is our primary users are also including our data scientists, our data engineers, our application developers who are looking at more innovative ways of publishing clinical trial results, say via our Shiny applications. And then of course we have our secondary consumers, people who need to be able to view the results, our medical teams, our regulatory teams, medical writing. Anyone that I'm missing, Rafa and Andy?
We have clinical pharmacologists would also have access to it, and actually a number of our data managers in our structure would, because they do the SCTM programming within their within their remit. So there's quite a few people that rely on the SCE ultimately, but the primary ones are the statisticians and the statistical programs. I totally agree.
Okay, let's talk about the challenges. The main challenge, the change management, and it is a multi-layer problem. Probably could just spend the whole separate episode talking about it. But I want to touch on it first. Like, why is it such a big challenge implementing those environments? Megan, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. So I think when we talk about modernizing an SCE, it's a small term that can encompass a lot of change, right? And so you have, regardless of what new technology you're implementing, there's always change challenges, right? So you have those traditional change challenges that come along with, people have been working a certain way and now you're asking them to do something new, have their muscle memory down for how they used to work, and now they have to, learn a new system. And so those challenges exist as a baseline. Additionally, when you talk about modernizing an SCE, you could be talking about a shift in programming languages from people who have been working decades in the industry using SAS, and now you're trying to encourage them to use R, or maybe even Python to do their work, right? Add that as another change you could be talking about. You could be talking about how you change the way that they do version control. And you're talking about using something like Git and introducing branching and merging, and it's a whole different way of working from how the industry's traditionally operated. So not only are you doing this kind of practical change management of selling people on, hey, here's the new system and here are the new features that you're getting, but you're also pairing that with selling people on a lot of other change, and in an industry that really hasn't changed that much in the way that we do programming in decades.
Yeah, it's really quite pivotal at the moment. We're changing more things all at the same time than I think we've ever done. So, for 38 years, I think I've said I've been in the industry, and we're still basically doing what I was doing 38 years ago in terms of how we approach our programming. We've been very good at kind of like job creation and kind of adding more and more tasks for the statistical programmer over the years, to the point that we're pretty indispensable in the process. But that change from SAS to R that a lot of companies are doing, that change from on-premise to in the cloud, and to give a very real example at Novo, we're having discussions around what are files anymore. So we're moving away from file systems to Databricks, and that whole question of, well, do you have files in Databricks? Are they in the conventional sense? So out the window are going things like file and directory structures, and so people are having to get used to that as well. It seems to be all at once as we're trying to really revolutionize what we do. And it's a good thing. It's about time after almost 40 years.
Yeah, if I can add there as well. So we're talking about change into introducing these systems as well. But I think one of the key elements of modernization as well is the frequency by which things move. Because as you mentioned, working within the field, that things haven't changed for a while now. There has been a lot of progress that is happening on the side, and things just keep getting faster, especially with now AI and everything getting into the mix. It's also super important, I believe, to talk about change management in the perspective of how fast are we going to keep up with changes. It's not just about stability anymore. It's really being able to um, adapt new technologies, new tools, new processes that could make a difference in the end game.
I do want to ask about the getting because I think a big part of it is also getting the buy-in from different stakeholders, the users, people who are going to work with those tools. So from your perspective, from your experience, how do you actually convince all those people who were historically who work with SaaS, for instance, who have been working with SaaS for many years, and now we have shifting towards more open source? How do you convince those people, and how you help them actually navigate this change? Andrew?
Yeah, so if you don't actually give them a reason to change, then people won't change. So the first thing is to set your company strategy to say, well, this is where we're going to be in the future. Yes, SaaS may play a part of that in the future, but predominantly maybe we're going to move to R as a programming language. And then, of course, you've got to provide all of the tools and support to enable programmers to transition from one language to another, as well as providing the kind of like the legacy environment, so that when you need to go back and refer to what you've done in the past, you can do that and understand the work that you did. It helps a lot to have kind of advocates within your organization. I mean, we're quite lucky at Novo. We have a lot of graduates who come in with R and Python skills and are shouting almost daily, say, let me use Python or let me use R, kind of thing. So that aspect's fairly straightforward. But it's the people that have the 20-30 years of SaaS that we recognize that's a difficult change for a lot of those. So having things like super user groups, advocates, as I say, for using these languages, and regular discussions on process change or what it means to be doing it in R over SaaS, for example, is critical. So, Megan?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that the what's in it for me is always a good place to start when you're trying to achieve change. And I think in addition to focusing on things like this makes you more competitive in the market, because it's not just our company that's making this move, it's the industry, right? And so if you can provide a space for your employees to be able to upskill within your company, that's great for them, right? Because they are making themselves more competitive externally as well, right? As they help you achieve your departmental goals. And there's also I think the recognition and reward aspect of it, which is once you've set those goals of this is what we're trying to do as an organization, being highly intentional about what gets the most visibility. And if you have people who are experimenting with R, who are kind of rising to that challenge of let's think differently about the way that we work, let's try to use, let's say your goal is to move towards R, right? How do we use some of these like open source industry collaborations to make the way that we work more efficient? Like if those are getting the platforms, if those are getting the recognition, then that incentivizes everyone to try to see how they can contribute to that as well.
And Rafa, would you add anything before we move to probably what interests the most of our listeners, the implementation part of it?
Yeah, I think that I agree with everything that was said, especially when it comes to user stakeholders. having new graduates and people that already know R and Python, that pushes like a significant or it acts as a significant leverage for change. But I also want to talk about specifically about other stakeholders within the environment, especially when it comes to IT teams and when it comes to compliance teams and management teams or QA teams, where in some cases there's also some resistance to change when it comes down to that at the end of the day. And some of the experiences that we've had in implementing some of these systems, they don't really come from the users themselves, but come from the people who are supporting the systems at the end of the day. That's one of, I think, of the more critical challenges and one of the key stakeholders that sometimes it's really hard to convince, because if you talk about convincing, data scientists that knows R, or they could transition to R and SAS, they could continue doing their work. But if you try to convince an IT admin that has been 20 years managing an SAS system and suddenly now they need to move to the cloud, that becomes quite a more difficult conversation to have. So,
okay, Andrew, you 2 years ago, more or less 2 years ago, I think you had you gave a presentation on Fuse about the implementation of the SCE. Could you talk us what were the main design decisions and considerations when you were first implementing the SCE?
Yeah, I mean, at the time we had a 2-server setup. So we had our R server that had been set up, and then we had an aging on-premise SaaS server, which so many companies have. It was something like 12 years old, and running out of spare parts, literally, to keep this thing up and running. So we made an early decision to say, well, really, we want SAS, R, Python all on the same platform. It kind of makes sense because you're accessing the data directly from a single platform. Users or programmers of those languages can actually choose the best language for the best situation. And so you bring in a lot of choice to people about how to do that. And then some of the decisions weren't actually made at that time. So Databricks, for example, was a fairly recent decision by Novo Nordisk as a part for their clinical data repository. And of course, you have to start tying these things together. So Databricks is something that we are now heavily committed to. Recently, I think won an award, I think, as a Databricks partner. But then you've got to consider things like your metadata repository and how you're going to implement that. So we're using Study Builder there for our metadata repository. It's kind of intrinsic in our SCTM internal process that we built up, which is SAS-based and is going to remain SAS-based. But we want to make sure that we don't have a separate NDR, for example, for tables, figures, and listings, as well as for random data sets. So there's just a couple of considerations, but there are kind of many more around version control, access control, single sign-on, as well as what your corporate IT are telling you that you have to implement as well. So sometimes you have an umbrella across you which says you must do certain things, and that has to be taken into account.
I've got 2 follow-up questions. Like, having the knowledge that you have now, are there any things that you would do differently? And also, like, what's the current state of the development of your SCE? Where are you now after those 2 years?
So we've had a couple of reverses in direction. We initially went for an off-the-shelf type approach with a company. I won't say the name, but we decided that didn't quite meet the ambitions that we had as an organization. So we went for a more bespoke design of our system, which means we have a lot of different moving parts. And for example, we've implemented SAS via. Our original R server has now been revamped, and will be a key part of that environment as we go forward. So in one respect, we've actually not succeeded. We've still got two different platforms, one for SAS and one for R and Python, and that's a disappointment. But we recognise that the industry as such, we may well find that in 2-3 years' time, that becomes an option for us again, and that we're going to pursue that path. But So yeah, so that's kind of where we are. We're still developing it at the moment.
Still work in progress.
Yeah.
If I
And
can
Megan,
add
I want to,
something
yeah.
before we move, I
Um,
find it interesting as well that you mentioned specifically, Andrew, that you believe that you failed in that aspect to make it all together. But that's a very interesting notion, especially when you compare across different industries and the notion of the compute environment across them. One of the more interesting trends is that you select the best tool for the job at the end of the day, best of breed type of concept, right? So according to the definition that you gave, that you wanted to bring everything under the same umbrella, that might have been a miss. But I would say that it doesn't it's not necessarily something bad at the end of the day. If you have two tools and two systems, it's a legitimate strategy, and it's something that um, it works very well in different areas. It also gives you a lot of advantages, right? Before we started talking here, we discussed trade-offs, right? Sometimes it's not about the solution; it's really about the trade-off. What are we willing to exchange?
Yeah, it's about having an agile mindset and how you actually approach. You're building your SCE, and sometimes we the Novo feature that we reach for the stars when we actually set out to do something. And maybe you can't quite reach those, but it doesn't mean that we failed at all. In fact, we have a very satisfactory solution going forward that allows us to use all three languages. And because of how our data and file structure is going to work in the future, I mean, you're just submitting your data to one server versus the other when you come to doing your compute. So it doesn't really matter too much at the end of the day. So yeah, a lofty ambition. Yeah, maybe it wasn't so needed. So.
And Megan, what are the trade-offs in your case in
so
jazz?
much of that resonates, right? Everything from the phrase reversals in direction, which we've had a few of ourselves for sure, to that conversation around trade-offs. So to expound on that a little bit more, so I'm gonna say we first started talking about modernizing our stats compute environment maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. And we started with, what if we just upgrade our current server? And, that fizzled out because it wasn't helping us achieve our departmental goals, right? So that was the first, and I think the right reversal in direction. Then we went out to the market and we said, what's out there? And there wasn't really a perfect solution. There didn't seem to be something that balanced both those ambitious goals that we had around modernizing our environment with offering those baseline features that we were talking about earlier for our statistical programmers, and doing that in a way that would help smooth the change that we knew that they would have to go through. And so the approach that we started going down was to build our own internally, do a bespoke solution. And one of our guiding principles of that was, we have programmers who will need to be doing traditional stats programming work, working on submission deliverables, but also those very same people are going to be working on automation projects or innovation projects. They'll be experimenting with different ways of working. We want to give them one platform, and that was the strategic direction that we started to go down. After many months of building and focusing on non-GXP applications, that was our approach, right? Let's build out for non-GXP applications as our first phase, and then build upon that to make that GXP compliant. What we've learned very acutely was that the trade-off we were making there was the ability to have a delightful user experience. And a lot of that comes down to your resources, right? If you have a big team, if you have deep pockets to do this, then you can achieve all of the requirements that you have set out, or most of them, or most of your must-haves. And we were just finding that at the end of the day, we were having to sacrifice so many of the things that we thought that were actually crucial to being able to sell people on this new system. And so we took a step back and we said, let's go back out to the market, and focus a bit more on what we want to do as a pharma company and what are our core competencies versus what do we want to outsource to a vendor. We don't necessarily, as our company, we didn't want to get into the business of developing an SCE, maintaining an SCE, validating an SCE with the resources that we had. We felt that those resources could have better been spent elsewhere.
I think we're slowly touching on the one of the most important things is whether buy internally or buy a ready solution, and also build in-house or outsource. So I just want to start with what are the how would you suggest for pharmaceutical companies, what kind of considerations they should think of when deciding whether they should build something on their own, or maybe choose something that is already ready-made. And I want to start with Rafa.
Hey, so adding a comment still to with what you mentioned, Megan, as well, highlighting the back and forth. I think that's one of the important elements as well to understand, and part of the modernization that we talk about. And when we were talking about change management, this is one of the important points as well, which is going modern as well in some cases means enabling yourself to shift and to still remain within your given parameters, right? And that's one of the important elements that I think that we should be able to say. And when it comes to the buy versus build, I mean, this is a story that both of you gave different perspectives, right? As well, in terms of starting with one solution and then moving another way, and again starting from the other way and moving towards somewhere else. And it ultimately comes down really to trade-offs and what are we willing to change. One of the important things that we've understood with some of the research that we've gathered over the last couple of weeks and months is that one of the important key elements is going to be cost. But cost, it doesn't just necessarily need to be the cost of a license. It could be the cost of maintenance. It could be the cost of overhead. It could be the cost of implementation, the cost of validation. So there's a lot of trade-offs that need to be taken into account. And I believe that every company is going to have a different profile in terms of whether they are going to buy or to build. It depends highly on the appetite for risk. It depends highly on, do they have these capabilities internally to maintain it in the long run? And these are questions that are very important to be asked, but I don't think that there's one clear answer to this question, right? If you're looking for something highly specialized and you have the team to do it, go for it. If you want to have something that is easy to use, you don't want to touch it, you don't want to have the headaches of managing it, maybe going with a buy solution is the right way to go. So again, trade-offs, no clear answer.
It all depends. But I think you touched also on the you were mentioning a lot of different costs. So I just want to hear, Megan, and your perspectives on different, what kind of costs are very important for you? Would you rather maybe have a high upfront cost for a license, but then maybe with time, maintenance will be cheaper? I'm not sure how those trades are gonna exactly work, but what kind of costs would you you are more willing to pay for that solution, for the...
It's a great question. I think Rafa touched on a lot of those, right? Which is that you're looking at things like support, you're looking at things like validation. And so I think it's reasonable in a lot of cases, or with a lot of system builds, to say, okay, you build, you have a high upfront cost as your barrier to entry, and then maintenance decreases over time. What we found with the non-GXP part of our platform was that the ongoing maintenance costs were actually not as low as we maybe thought, because we are constantly trying to evolve this platform. There's new requirements that are coming in, there's new technologies that are in, and that DevOps cost of being able to actually keep pace with what was going on outside of pharma, even, that we wanted to be embedding into our platform, that's where we were starting to see some of those costs start to add up. Whereas if you go to a company that's productizing that, then you're sharing the cost of that DevOps, of the validation, which we all know validation is usually even more expensive than the actual development. And we weren't even doing validation on our non-GXP platform that we were building, right? And so I think that was one of the wake-up calls for us, was to see, okay, we went into this making the assumption that maintenance costs would be low, but in actuality, in order to get to kind of pick things off our backlog and keep building them into the product, that was going to be a sustained investment for several years.
Yeah, I think these are extremely good points, and you know, I don't think there's like you say, there's a right or wrong answer in terms of the direction you go. It's only a question of what's best fit for your company as a whole at that particular moment in time. You know, and obviously, you know, we're trying to build our own, which means we're probably going to get a lot more costs as we go forward. And particularly one aspect that is worth mentioning around that is cloud. And the more people we get onto using R and onto the cloud, so our costs are going to actually increase over time. What we're seeing at the moment is actually a fairly exponential increase in cost, which, okay, it's gone from a fairly low base up to a reasonably high base at the moment, and it's set to continue. So one thing you do have to factor in are your cloud licensing costs, and you know, also the cost of you know, explaining to your staff not to use the biggest Kubernetes cluster that they can invent in order to run their job that requires a 16th of the size, because that adds tremendously to the ongoing costs as you go forward. So there's a user training piece to working in the cloud and understanding how these things should operate in a practical sense. But yeah, it really depends where you are. Otherwise, as a company, what's good for one is different for another. Sure.
If I can jump into that, I really like the point that you mentioned for cloud cost, because that's sometimes I guess we're talking about here hidden costs at the end of the day, which is it's not as simple as you're going to buy or build. You need to take into account some of the costs that go under this. And I think that the cloud is a very big one. We talk about cloud as one of the, I mentioned cloud specifically as one of the key points of modernization, or in the key indicators of willingness to modernize. But it's again not a one solution fits all at the end of the day. Costs are going to be incremental within the cloud, but it's also a trade-off that companies need to measure at the end of the day. It's not a magic bullet. You're suddenly not going to run out of issues because of database management or because networking issues. It's not going to solve all of your problems. It's just going to shift it elsewhere, usually.
And I think a very important part of it is also like the skill set and capacities, and that you also need to think about short term and long term. So Rafa, how would you also think? Because there are probably some things that we won't think at the beginning. We might not need certain skills or capacities at the moment we're building the solution, but maybe within the time. So what kind of competencies do we need
for cloud
with building and maintenance?
Yeah, so I think that we talked about, or Andrew mentioned specifically, democratization of data, right? I think that cloud also brings democratization of technology at the end of the day. It becomes more accessible. Sure, that comes with a specific cost, but it enables people and it becomes more accessible at the end of the day. If you think about, let's think about an example of a database, a SQL database, an Oracle database, something that you typically would run on-prem. Think about how many people you need to actually maintain this at the end of the day. You need the database admin, you need the security team, you need to put the lights on the data center, you need to have the security people at the data center. When you move to the cloud, these costs are abstracted away. So you don't have the cost of managing this, you pay for the database. And best thing is you can just give the accesses to a data scientist and he will provision the database himself. So in terms of the skill sets that are required, I think that the biggest skill set is really having an open mind and being able to willing to enable the users. Because if we talk about modernization, we keep going back to this trend as well of adjusting the trade-offs and enabling the users and being able to have flexibility. I think that's one of the big advantages that the cloud brings at the end of the day, and it enables people. Obviously, there are a couple of hard skills that people would need to have within this transition. But just having that specific mindset of being able to enable people, and instead of, hey, let me provision this database for you, it's more like, let me figure out how I can give the user the power and enablement for them to do it themselves. And little by little, you have a team that is able to do more by themselves than with a whole bunch of support. I know this isn't exactly the right answer, but I think it's one of the key important things to take into account into these startups is the willingness to adjust, the willingness to adapt, and to learn new stuff. If you are 28 years working with an SAS language and suddenly somebody puts R in front of you, it's not impossible for you to learn. And sometimes you will find that it's easier than it looks, but you need to have the willingness to just do it.
It's an interesting point. If I can just very briefly kind of touch on something that you brought up, Rafa, in terms of maybe enabling users to do things like build their own databases. I've certainly noticed that at Jazz as we shift towards this new approach. Our IT teams, and so we I think regardless of which way we end up going and what our solution for an SDE ends up being, one of the fundamental requirements is that we do need it to be compatible with our enterprise infrastructure. So we don't want to have to maintain separate databases. We don't want to have to maintain separate copies of data in a vendor system. We want those to be able to be deployed in such a way that they can leverage Jazz's data assets, and we believe that clinical data is one of those data assets, and we need to start producing it in a way that makes it more of an asset. But I've definitely noticed that our IT colleagues are used to working with people who are okay with what they do being a little bit of a black box, right? And hey, what do you need? We'll do it for you. Whereas in a programming department, in a data science department, people want to be a little bit more self-sufficient. They want to be able to experiment. And I think that becomes, regardless of what approach that you take, that it goes back to even what we were talking about, change management with your stakeholders. It becomes part of that change management of how does our relationship change as part of this modernization? Are you supporting people who maybe you haven't supported before in a different way? And we've gone along a journey of being able to move towards making our IT department more comfortable with the idea of the business users having more control over their appropriate controls, I should say, right? Appropriate amount of governance, but still giving them the flexibility that they need to be able to experiment and work.
When you were talking about the cloud, I also want to ask about one more thing related to the cloud, Rafa. Because there's a lot of hesitance around the security. So where those concerns come from when it comes to the cloud not being secure, and how do you actually address them?
Yeah, I think that mainly it stems from two major topics. One is control, because when you move to the cloud, you cede a lot of control basically to a different entity. You trust that an Amazon or a Microsoft is going to be able to manage all of the things that you used to manage internally for you in a successful way. So control is a lot of something that comes into mind. And then the second thing is also the fact that it's sort of a black box at the end of the day. We talk about cloud being to enabling people, but some of the elements within the cloud are a black box, and this also generates a lot of lack of knowledge issues about the tools themselves. So when people lose control and when they face things that they don't understand, they get way more apprehensive about adopting something new at the end of the day. So if you ask me, would you trust better Amazon to hold my data, or a company that I haven't heard of that has their own data center and I have never seen it or heard of them or have no idea what's happening on the background? I tend to say that I trust more Amazon because it's more transparent in the way that this happens. Not to say that it's going to be more secure or less secure, but the point that I'm trying to make is that it definitely doesn't need to be less secure at the end of the day. I really think it comes down to these two elements: control and lack of knowledge.
And Andrew, Megan, do you want to add anything onto this?
Yeah, I mean, we've been using, we're kind of, we don't mind whether we use Azure or whether we use AWS. That's part of our defined strategy within our IT group. But I agree. I mean, there's kind of like, and this is going back to the on-premise versus in the cloud. I think one of the reasons why IT perhaps prefer things to be on-premise is a control question, isn't it? So, and I've seen that in previous companies where they're resistant to say moving everything into the cloud because they like to have control and ownership of the physical hardware. That's fine if that suits that company. But I think these organizations are so big, they're going to get it right really 99.99% of the time. So the risks are really small. And probably when you think about it, your data is just one tiny piece of data within a vast warehouse of data. So the chances are that they actually, somebody were to breach their defenses and actually get to data. Will they get to my data? The risk is really, really small. And the understanding, I guess, of how to set these things up and actually secure them, is probably better in a contained, organization versus spread out. I think from that point of view. So,
we asked.
So say nothing to add. Well said. I think interesting questions that I've been seeing in the chat.
Cool. Because we are like we're running out of time. We still have some time, but I definitely want to talk a little bit more about the technology. We already agreed that the perfect SCE doesn't really exist, and it's all about the trade-offs, and it all depends on circumstances. What you're doing with your data. But Rafa, I want to ask you about the tech setup. Like, what kind of tools, what kind of technology, languages do you recommend, maybe as a foundation, as a base, to build that?
Yeah. SCE? So in terms of recommendations, I would rather talk about the trend and some of the technology that I see being more used across the industry. So the big one is definitely containers. I think that this is a fundamental technology that enables so much in terms of reusability, in terms of reproducibility, in terms of making sure that things are standardized within the industry. And this is such a flexible tool at the end of the day that it just enables so much. So it's a trend that I start to see that, you want to go through a specific submission. You want to give somebody the ability to reproduce exactly your outputs with the exact same things. You give them a container. That's one of the things that I definitely recommend, that if there is no containerization strategy, then definitely it should be thought of. And then the second thing is, I guess this comes down also to personal preference as well. It comes down to Kubernetes, which is the way that you orchestrate containers. It's such an amazing tool that you can put into the mixture, where you add this element of reproducibility and you add a language to tell it what it should do. And it just enables things at a very big scale and in a very reproducible way. I would bet that a lot of the work that Andrew, you've done, and you, Megan, have done have definitely revolved around containers. And I would be willing to bet that if you are not using Kubernetes, then it was definitely a part of the list in the past. So from a platform perspective, those are the two words to look up, I would say.
Is Rafa right?
Yeah, and we use both of those, Kubernetes and containers. You're absolutely right in that sense. One other thing that we haven't really touched on, and we're probably running out of time, but it's like workflow management and the potential for agentic AI. And I see somebody asked about GenAI actually in the comments, and I think that's something that we're just starting to branch out into, and I think this will become a major feature as we kind of go forward. And we'll need to fit into our SCE strategy as we go forward. So not so much a technology as such, but more a methodology in terms of how we would work with our SCEs in the future. So I just wanted to add that.
And I agree with both of those. I mean, containerization and Kubernetes were a key part of, even as we built that like foundational infrastructure for our non-GXP analyses. And we've seen the results of that like pretty much instantaneously as soon as we cut people over from our legacy like non-Kubernetes like RStudio and Posit installs to the Kubernetes based. Our users are just delighted by the improvement in performance, the improvement in control that they have via containers. So another plug for those two elements. The other thing that I was thinking about as you were asking the question, that was the extensibility of the platform and the ability to be able to connect in a modular way to new tools that you want to be able to use. We're trying to experiment with AWS Bedrock, and for those of you who aren't familiar with AWS, that's their host of large language models that you don't need to host them yourselves. You can just kind of API in, use the models. So being able to quickly connect your environment to services like that, being able to plug in, I see a comment in the chat around our Shiny apps. We have a way of publishing our Shiny apps, and being able to do that in a seamless way for the users, absolutely critical as we think differently about what types of projects we work on, in what way we want to be able to publish our results to our stakeholders.
Okay, let's just leave those for or maybe just like a line of a summary from each of you before we go to the questions.
Yeah.
Question. Does the perfect SCE exist?
No, because I think we're still developing a lot of the technologies, and I think we're yet to see the impact of things like AI on what we do as programmers and statisticians. I do think it's very exciting. I don't see it as a massive threat to what we do. I think it's that helpful thing that sits on your shoulder and actually tells you what to do when you need to do it, kind of thing, and takes some of the mundane out of what you're trying to do from an everyday activity as a programmer. But the journey's just begun, I think.
Megan,
did you say one sentence or one word? No. I think could a perfect. Well, let me maybe start by saying, of course, everyone has a different idea of what they want their SCE to be, right? And we even see it with the comparison between Jazz and Novo in this conversation, right? And like we talked about trade-offs, we talked about what is perfect for your organization, and can you get closer to that with a buy versus build approach? I expect that we have different even ideas of what that perfect SCE might look like. Can you as an organization achieve a perfect SCE as you define it with unlimited time and resources? Sure. Do any of us have that? No. And so I think one of the key takeaways from today's podcast is trade-offs. Thank you, Rafa, for introducing that term. It just comes down to how close can you get to that ideal, and what are you trading off to get other aspects of the things that are more important guiding principles for you. There's probably 4 sentences. Sorry about that, Nat.
That's okay. I'll take all of them. And Rafa?
So clear cut, no. I don't think it exists, and I think that that's part of for me, being technical person that loves discussing these topics and loves delving into these. I think that's the beauty of it as well at the end of the day. I'm sorry to say, but I kind of disagree, Megan, in terms of with unlimited resources, would we get there? I would say even if we got those, and if we got the perfect SCE, you're going to get the next thing right away that you have to build again. You're never going to get there, right? I mentioned containers, Kubernetes, Andrew mentioned AI. It's the perfect example, right? You're thinking you're getting there, you're thinking you're reaching that level, you're going to have it perfect, and then something else drops, which I think is part of the essence of modernization as well. I really believe that from all of this, one of the things that I would take is that prepare for change, regular change is definitely something to take from it.
Okay, Andrew, you touched on this this question, but maybe Megan, Rafa, you will want to add something more. What impacts do you expect GenAI will have on the clinical analysis process, skill set, and the use of SCEs?
If you want to go really bold, I think it has the potential to completely revolutionize it. I mean, we've been having conversations as a department about, do we need specs? Do we need all these things that are traditionally part of the process if we can use agents to be able to automate so much of what it is that we do? I think it changes. Do we have people programming, or do we have people reviewing code? Do we have people, again, programming, writing specs, or do we have them focus on governance and standards? And so I think it's, given that we've got some limited time left, that's my initial thought. Rafa, Andy?
Yeah, Rafa?
So, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think it's going to be a complete revolution as we kind of go forward. I think our program is actually going to be doing first pass programming in the future so much. So it could well be that 80% of the programming work could actually be done by AI, and then you have humans actually checking that it's been done correctly and validating that it's been done correctly. You could even have another AI model actually check the first AI model if you really want to, and I know a company that's actually started to do that in this space as well. But I don't think it takes the programmers out of the loop. I think the programmer role will change and evolve as a result of this. Maybe we will become, as we are in Novo Nordisk, clinical data scientists rather than statistical programmers. More and more as we go forward, understanding the data, explaining the story of the data. But there's no doubt it's a revolution that is definitely coming.
Yeah, I agree with. Yeah, I agree with everything said. I would just add that this also falls nicely into what we talked about, enablement, because I think that the major one thing that GenAI is going to bring is just enabling users to do more and be more efficient at the end of the day. I don't think that replacing, as you mentioned, there's always going to have to be a human in the mixture. There's always going to have to be a check, somebody that verifies and confirms everything that is done. But I think that the more immediate impact that we will start seeing is just people being enabled to do more and faster and quicker. And I think that's going to be the biggest impact. And we talk about this in this area, but it's going to be across all different areas. We are already seeing that in a lot of different places.
Just one more that question from Jared. Have you ever encountered issues where you were weighing the cost of using the same vendor or being willing to look at another vendor knowing that the trade-off of having to completely rewrite your platform and the process becomes a large deterrent to the point that where you are stuck with a single vendor? Have you ever encountered such a problem? If so, how did you deal with that? And if not, how would you approach that issue?
I think we talked about trade-offs, and I think luckily at Novo, whenever we've had to make these decisions, and I mentioned earlier on, we've gone down several alternate paths at times. We've always had a choice. We've never yet reached the point where we were stuck in a corner and we would say, right, okay, this is the only choice that we can make. One of the good things, in terms of being in a multi-language environment is, you can decide ultimately which is your preferred language, and that kind of impacts your decision-making process. So you're not forced down a certain direction or forced to stay there. And it's a little bit of a warning, perhaps, to some of the vendors that you need to make sure that your language is accessible, to the users that are going to come out of the university and so on to use it. So I will just add that for one particular vendor.
The other aspect of that too is not only what are your trade-offs from a system perspective, but from the perspective of maybe what your organization could look like 3 to 5 years from now if you stayed with that vendor because it's more cost effective in the short term, what does that do to your ability to keep pace in the industry? So, do you view your SCE as a competitive advantage or not? And every company can have a different answer to that question. But I think that's the conversation that needs to be had, looking at, can you automate? Can you maybe reduce the number of programmers that you need on it's putting more dimensions into that cost equation than just what's the cost of the actual platform itself.
So I can add something, not from picking a vendor perspective, but I can say that this is an age-old problem, right? This is vendor lock-in. This is something that has existed across multiple industries at the tech level for a while now, and it has existed in many shapes or forms in other places. I believe that your prospects are correct. I mean, it's a bullet that you will have to bite at some point, but it really helps take into the picture that if you look at it from a longer span perspective, the impact, the hidden costs, as we talked about, right? Everything else that takes into account, it becomes easier to justify this to management or to take a look into an approach. Additionally, I would say that also looking at this from a strategic bet, I think that's also something to take into account, because as Andrew mentioned, when you have different languages you can pick, but also you need to have different languages supported to be able to do that. And that definitely becomes a competitive edge at the end of the day. So, yeah.
Okay, we ran out of time. I haven't got the message that the session was extended. Thank you so much for everyone who's persisted and stayed with us until the end. Thank you so much for your time and sharing all the insights. I feel I could probably now just talk forever, but yeah, it's been such a pleasure having you here and listening all the insights. I think all of the listeners enjoyed as well. We will share the report, as I said, once it's published next week, and wish everyone a great day ahead, or evening, depending on where you are based. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.